The concept of justice is often viewed as a weight that the state imposes upon the individual. Yet there are rare, haunting moments in history where the weight is instead carried by the guilty, who find the burden of their own continued existence to be the ultimate sentence. It is a peculiar facet of human nature that the very thing we are wired to protect, our own lives, can become a source of such profound psychic agony that the cold embrace of the law's finality is seen as a sanctuary rather than a punishment. We often think of the courtroom as a battlefield where the accused fights for every second of breath. But occasionally, the roles reverse, and the gavel becomes an instrument of mercy for a soul that has already retreated into a self-imposed exile of the mind. Tonight, we find ourselves in the quiet, rolling landscapes of the American Midwest during the transition between autumn and winter, specifically in the year 1994. The air in Illinois at this time of year has a way of turning sharp and brittle, smelling of dried corn husks and the first hints of wood smoke drifting from distant chimneys. The sky is often a flat, unmoving gray, a ceiling of clouds that seems to press down upon the flat horizons of the farmland. It is a place of immense stillness, where the sounds of a passing freight train can carry for miles across the open fields, a lonely metallic rhythm that underscores the isolation of the rural towns scattered like seeds across the dark, tilled earth. James was a man who, for much of his life, had been defined by a quiet, almost invisible presence. He was someone who worked with his hands, finding a sense of order in the mechanical humming of a local factory, where the repetitive nature of the assembly line offered a predictable structure to his days. He was a man of simple habits. He kept a small, tidy home with a porch that faced the sunset, and he was known to spend his Saturday mornings at the local hardware store, lingering over the scent of fresh cedar and motor oil. To those who saw him at the grocery store or the post office, James was a background character in the story of the town. A polite nod, a man who paid his bills on time, and a person who seemed to possess the steady, unremarkable temperament of the landscape itself. However, beneath this veneer of rural normalcy, a profound and silent erosion was taking place. The investigation would later reveal that James had been living in a state of increasing internal fragmentation, a process that left no outward scars but hollowed out the foundations of his spirit. By the late autumn of 1994, the internal pressure had reached a point of no return. On a Tuesday evening, when the wind was rattling the bare branches of the oak trees outside his window, James committed an act that shattered the peace of his community and severed his connection to the world of the living. He took the lives of those closest to him, his wife, Sarah, and their young son, in a manner that the police reports would describe as methodical, almost trance-like in its execution. The silence that followed the event was not the silence of peace, but the heavy, suffocating stillness of a void. James did not flee. He did not attempt to hide the evidence or concoct an alibi. Instead, he sat in the kitchen of his home, the linoleum floor cold beneath his feet, and waited for the morning light to reveal what he had done. He watched the shadows of the trees stretch across the walls as the moon moved across the sky, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock on the mantel, the mundane anchors of a life that no longer existed. When the sun finally began to bleed over the horizon, casting a pale, weak light into the room, he picked up the telephone and calmly informed the authorities of his location. When the first patrol car arrived, the officers found James sitting on his front porch. He was wearing a heavy flannel jacket and holding a lukewarm cup of coffee, staring out at the frost-covered grass of his front yard. According to the police report, he did not look like a man who had just committed a double homicide. He looked like a man who had finally finished a long and exhausting journey. His voice was steady as he directed them inside, and his cooperation was so absolute that it unnerved the seasoned investigators. He was not seeking forgiveness, and he was not expressing the frantic remorse that often accompanies such tragedies. He was simply present, a witness to his own ruin. The legal proceedings that followed were marked by a singular and chilling focus. While his court-appointed defense team scrambled to find evidence of diminished capacity or temporary insanity, James remained a calm and dissenting voice in his own defense. From the very first pre-trial hearing, he made his intentions clear to the judge, the prosecution, and the horrified gallery. He did not want a trial. He did not want a plea bargain. He wanted the state to carry out the ultimate penalty. He spoke of the law not as an adversary, but as a necessary conclusion to the narrative he had written. "The debt is clear," he told the court in a voice that was recorded as being devoid of theatricality. "I am simply asking for the ledger to be closed." This request placed the judicial system in a profound moral and procedural dilemma. The law is designed to protect the rights of the accused, often even against their own wishes. The mercy of the gavel, as it began to be whispered in the corridors of the courthouse, became a point of intense debate. Was it an act of justice to grant a killer his wish for death? Or was the state becoming an instrument of assisted suicide? James, however, was indifferent to the philosophical debates. For him, the walls of his jail cell were merely a temporary waiting room. He spent his days in quiet contemplation, refusing most visitors and declining the various appeals that were filed on his behalf by well-meaning advocates. The atmosphere in the prison was one of muted tension. The guards noted that James was a model inmate, a man who followed every rule with a precision that bordered on the mechanical. He kept his small cell meticulously clean, the scent of industrial soap and bleached linens providing a sterile backdrop to his final months. He ate his meals in silence, watching the steam rise from the plastic trays, and he walked the exercise yard with a measured gait, his eyes always fixed on the distant horizon beyond the razor wire. He was a man who had already departed. His physical body was simply waiting for the legal machinery to catch up with his spirit. As the execution date approached, a strange stillness settled over the case. The media, which had initially been a frenzy of sensationalist headlines, found little to feed on in James's stoic acceptance. There were no outbursts, no dramatic confessions, and no last-minute pleas for clemency. There was only the steady, inevitable march toward the midnight hour. The investigation had long since concluded that there were no other suspects, no hidden motives beyond the dark, internal collapse that had triggered the event. The tragedy was complete in its horror, and James was determined that the resolution be equally absolute. On the night scheduled for the sentence to be carried out, the weather turned exceptionally cold. A light dusting of snow began to fall, swirling in the beams of the prison's perimeter lights like tiny flickering ghosts. Inside the walls, the air was thick with the scent of floor wax and the low electrical hum of the facility's power grid. James was offered a final meal, which he accepted but barely touched. A simple plate of bread and fruit. He thanked the staff for their professionalism, a gesture that many found deeply haunting. He was then led toward the chamber, his footsteps echoing in the long, tiled corridor with a rhythm that was neither hurried nor hesitant. In the final moments, as he was prepared for the end he had so fervently requested, James looked toward the observation window. He did not look at the witnesses with malice or with a plea for understanding. He simply closed his eyes, his breathing slowing to a deep, rhythmic pace. The heavy burden of conscience, which had been his constant companion since that Tuesday in autumn, seemed to lift as the silence of the law finally took hold. The gavel had fallen, and for James, it was the only mercy he believed he deserved. The danger, the tragedy, and the long, cold wait were over. As we reflect on this story, we recognize that the events are now part of the distant past, tucked away in the archives of a quiet Midwestern county. The night remains still, the fields are at rest, and you are safe in the present, far removed from the shadows of 1994. It is time to let the story fade and find your own path into a deep and restorative sleep. Would you like me to continue with the next chapter and explore the early life of James to see where the first cracks in the foundation began to form? Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before we begin, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you are tuning in from tonight. Get comfortable. Let the weight of the day settle into your mattress and breathe with the rhythm of the rain. Tonight, we explore a story not of a chase, but of a surrender. A case where the mystery isn't who, but why a soul would plead for the ultimate finality. The air around us is heavy with the scent of old paper, the kind that has rested in a high-ceilinged library for decades, absorbing the silence of 1,000 forgotten afternoons. Outside, the rain is persistent, a soft autumn rhythm against the leaded glass windows, blurring the world into shades of gray and charcoal. We are safe here, tucked away from the cold, watching a single, flickering candle flame dance in the corner of the room, casting long, lazy shadows that move in time with the wind. As we settle into this space, we find ourselves transported to a different kind of quiet. We are in South Carolina, in a courtroom that feels more like a cathedral of secular law than a place of modern bureaucracy. The year is 1985, and the atmosphere is thick with the specific, unchanging weight of Southern justice. The room is vast, dominated by heavy oak pews that have been polished by the friction of 1,000 restless bodies over the years. You can almost smell the layers of floor wax, a clean, lemon-tinged scent that fights against the musk of damp wool coats and the faint, metallic tang of the oscillating fans that hum in the corners. These fans do little to move the humid air. They simply churn it, creating a low, hypnotic drone that mirrors the steady heartbeat of the rain outside. In this courtroom, time seems to stretch and thin. The afternoon light filters through tall, narrow windows, cutting through the dimness in long, diagonal shafts of gold. Within these beams, millions of dust motes perform a slow, chaotic ballet. They drift and swirl, seemingly suspended in the amber glow, oblivious to the gravity of the proceedings below. Each speck of dust represents a moment of stillness, a tiny fragment of a world that continues to turn even when human lives are hanging in the balance. The wood of the judge's bench is dark, nearly black, scarred by the gavels of the past and the nervous tapping of pens. It is a texture you can feel just by looking at it. The grain of the wood deep and ancient, like the skin of an old tree that has seen too many seasons. Justice is often a loud, clanging machine. But in this room, it was as quiet as a held breath. The silence was not empty. It was pressurized. It sat in the lungs of the spectators and the jurors, making every rustle of a legal pad or the squeak of a leather shoe sound like a thunderclap. The people gathered here were not looking for a culprit. The man sitting at the defense table had already stripped away the mystery of his guilt. Instead, they were looking for a reason. They were staring at a man who had looked into the eyes of the law and asked it to do its worst, not out of defiance, but out of a desperate, hollowed-out need for an end. We watched the light shift, the shadows grow longer across the carpeted floor, and we realized that the most profound stories aren't always found in the noise of the struggle, but in the crushing weight of the silence that follows. Would you like me to continue by describing the specific events of that day in the courtroom and what led the defendant to make his unprecedented plea? The air in the courtroom that morning carried the scent of floor wax and old paper, a heavy, institutional stillness that seemed to press against the tall windows. We find ourselves observing a man who had become a ghost in his own life, sitting at a wooden table that had been scarred by decades of legal battles. To understand the gravity of the moments that followed, we must look at the small, mundane details. The way the sunlight caught the dust motes dancing in the air, the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, and the soft shuffle of bailiffs moving along the carpeted aisles. At the time, the proceedings seemed standard, a scripted dance of motions and protocols. But the man at the center of the storm, identified as the one responsible for a series of tragedies that had shaken the quiet neighborhoods of West Columbia, was no longer interested in the dance. According to those present, his eyes did not wander toward the gallery or the exit. They remained fixed on the grain of the wood before him. It was a Tuesday, a day like any other. Yet the atmosphere was thick with the realization that the traditional fight for life was about to be abandoned. The investigation had been a long and winding road, filled with a quiet rustle of leafing through files and the low hum of fluorescent lights in late-night interview rooms. Detectives had spent months piecing together a timeline that felt less like a criminal enterprise and more like a slow, deliberate unraveling. As the prosecutor began to speak, detailing the events with a voice that was practiced and steady, the defendant did something that few in that room had ever witnessed. He did not lean toward his counsel to whisper a defense. He did not shake his head in denial. Instead, he waited for the silence to return, a silence that felt deep and horizonless. By the next hour, the plea was entered. But it was not the plea the public expected. It was a request for finality. He spoke of the weight of the shadows he had created, describing the burden of his own existence, with a detachment that was more unsettling than anger. He spoke of the victims not as statistics, but as lives that had been interrupted, and in doing so, he seemed to be trying to close a circle that had been left jagged and broken. The judge, a person who had seen the worst of human nature through a lens of tempered law, leaned forward. The room was so still that one could hear the faint whistle of the ventilation system. The defendant's voice was a low drone, lacking the sharp edges of a scream or the sudden spikes of emotion often found in fiction. It was a weary sound, like the fading light of a winter afternoon. He was not asking for mercy. He was asking for the opposite. He was asking for the state to perform the one act he could not reconcile himself to do alone. Not long after this declaration, a ripple of unease moved through the spectators. It was the sound of fabric rubbing against wood as people shifted in their seats, a collective intake of breath that is quickly muffled by the gravity of the situation. We see the legal teams huddled in the dim glow of their desk lamps, their faces etched with the confusion of a system that is built to protect life, even when the owner of that life no longer wishes to keep it. The process-oriented nature of the law began to grind its gears, looking for a precedent, a rule, or a statute that could contain such a singular, heavy request. According to the police report and the transcripts that would later be archived in heavy boxes, this was the moment the trial transformed from a quest for guilt into a philosophical crisis. The man sat, hands folded, watching the clock move toward the afternoon. He seemed to be drifting away from the room already, his mind fixed on a horizon where the noise of his past would finally be silenced. It is a story of a quiet man who sought the loudest possible end, not out of malice, but out of a desperate, hollowing stillness. As the sun begins to shift its angle, casting longer shadows across the South Carolina landscape, we observe the court adjourn for the day, leaving the heavy questions hanging in the cooling air. The danger of that time has long since passed, and the echoes of those words have softened into the pages of history, allowing us to remain in the safety of the present. Would you like me to continue by exploring the specific evidence the police found in his home that eventually led to this moment of total surrender? The heavy oak doors of the courtroom have long since closed, and the legal arguments that once filled the air with tension have settled into the quiet archives of South Carolina's history. To understand how a man could eventually beg for the finality of his own end, we must travel back before the sirens, before the headlines, and before the heavy iron gates of the South Carolina Department of Corrections became his only horizon. We find ourselves in West Columbia, a place where the landscape itself seems to move with a deliberate, almost weary slowness. It is a region defined by the Congaree River, where the water often looks like liquid bronze under the afternoon sun, thick with silt and moving through the pine barrens with a silence that feels ancient. In the 1960s and 70s, this was a world of long shadows and the scent of damp earth and pine resin, a place where the humidity of the South seemed to press down on everything, muffling the sounds of the neighborhood. James Terry Roach was a child of this quietude, and when we look back at his early life, we find a series of small domestic images that feel like a slow fading photograph, losing its color at the edges. In his mother's kitchen, there was a specific pattern on the linoleum floor, a series of interlocking cream and seafoam green diamonds, worn down in the center where the most footsteps had fallen over the years. It was a humble space, smelling often of toasted bread and the metallic tang of the well water that ran through the pipes. James was not a child of grand outbursts or loud ambitions. He was a boy who seemed to exist in the periphery of his own life, a quiet observer of the world who rarely felt the need to participate in its noise. There was a particular rhythm to his days that centered around a small, cluttered desk in the corner of his bedroom. While other boys his age were perhaps focused on the mechanical roar of engines or the physical competition of sports, James found a strange, solitary peace in the internal workings of old clocks. He would collect discarded timepieces, heavy brass alarm clocks, delicate pocket watches with cracked faces, and wooden mantel clocks that had lost their pulse. He spent hours under the glow of a single desk lamp, his small fingers navigating the intricate labyrinth of gears, springs, and escapements. The room was never truly silent. It is filled with a polyphonic texture of ticking. Some were rapid and light, like a heartbeat in flight, while others were deep and resonant, a steady thrum that anchored him to the present moment. He loved the logic of them, the way a single tooth on a gear could influence the entire passage of time, and how, with enough patience, a frozen moment could be made to move again. Yet, despite this fascination with time, James himself seemed to be slipping through it without leaving much of a trace. Those who knew him then struggled to recall specific conversations, remembering instead a presence that was merely there, like a piece of furniture you grow used to seeing but no longer notice. He was a man who moved through the world like a ghost long before he ever stepped into a cell. There was a profound melancholy in his trajectory, a sense that he was a passenger in his own body, watching the pine barrens of West Columbia pass by through a window he couldn't quite reach. As the rhythmic ticking of his clocks filled the small house, no one could have known that the gears of his own life were beginning to slip, moving toward a darkness that no amount of careful repair could ever truly fix. He remained a shadow in the bright Carolina sun, waiting for a sunset he didn't yet realize was coming. As the evening mist begins to roll off the Congaree and settle over the quiet streets of West Columbia, the ticking of those clocks fades into the natural stillness of the night. We move forward now, leaving the hum of the kitchen and the scent of pine behind, as the season shifts and a different, colder air begins to stir. Would you like me to continue by exploring the events of that October evening when the shadows finally grew long enough to change everything? The air in South Carolina during October carries a specific, deceptive weight. It is a time when the humid, heavy blanket of summer finally begins to fray at the edges, replaced by a sharp, crystalline chill that arrives only after the sun has dipped below the horizon. On this particular night in 1980, the wind moved through the skeletal branches of the oaks with a low rhythmic sigh, carrying the faint, earthy scent of dried leaves and wood smoke from distant chimneys. It was a night that felt remarkably ordinary, the kind of evening where most families were retreating behind the warmth of glowing windows, unaware of the two men sitting in a parked car watching the street. The meeting with his co-defendant was not marked by heated arguments or dramatic gestures, but by a heavy, mechanical monotony. We find them sitting in the front seat of a vehicle, the engine left idling to keep the heater humming against the creeping frost. To any passerby, it was merely a dull vibration in the air. But inside the cabin, the sound of that engine was all-consuming. It was a low, guttural thrum that vibrated through the floorboards and into their boots, a steady pulse that seemed to count down the seconds of a life that was about to be irrevocably altered. The rhythmic clicking of the cooling metal and the faint smell of gasoline created a bubble of artificial heat, isolating them from the world outside. The night was a canvas of deep blues and charcoal grays, hiding the choices that could never be unmade. According to the subsequent police reports, which provide a clinical and detached lens through which we must view these moments, the transition from observation to action was methodical. The investigation would later reconstruct the timeline with a cold, forensic precision that strips away the heat of human emotion. We see the details through the black and white ink of official statements. The exact make of the vehicle, the specific caliber of the tool brought along, and the calculated path taken toward the residence. There is a certain stillness in these reports, a lack of adjectives that forces us to focus on the raw geometry of the event. The officers noted the way the porch light cast a long, lonely shadow across the driveway, and how the silence of the neighborhood seemed to swallow the sound of approaching footsteps. It is here, in the quiet periphery of the crime, that we encounter the first of many contradictions. While the legal system usually prepares for a long, arduous battle to preserve a life, this case began to drift toward a different horizon. We must understand, even now as we walk through these early shadows, that this story does not end with a desperate plea for mercy or a frantic search for loopholes. Instead, the legal battle would end not with a plea for life, but a plea for the end. It is a rare and somber trajectory, where the person at the center of the storm eventually stops fighting the wind and instead asks to be carried away by it. By the time the first light of dawn began to gray the sky the following morning, the events had already been etched into the history of West Columbia. The forensic team arrived to find a scene that was as quiet as a museum. They documented the placement of every object with a lulling, professional routine. The dust on a windowsill, the position of a discarded jacket, the way the late autumn frost had crystallized on the glass. There is a strange peace in the way evidence is gathered. It is a slow, respectful process of listening to what the silence has to say. Not long after, the weight of the investigation would begin to settle, drawing a map of a night that began with an idling engine and ended with a quiet room, leaving behind a trail of charcoal grays that no amount of morning sun could ever truly bleach away. The transition from the open road to the confined space of a precinct is a shift that occurs not just in geography, but in the very nature of time itself. For James, the world had once been a series of expanding horizons. But as the heavy iron door of the holding cell clicked shut, his universe contracted to a space no larger than a few paces in any direction. There is a specific kind of coldness found in a municipal building at midnight, a chill that seems to seep upward from the foundation and settle into the marrow. The air carries the faint, sterile scent of industrial floor wax and the metallic tang of old pipes. We find him now in a world of hard angles and unyielding surfaces, where the only furniture is a narrow steel bunk bolted to the floor, and a thin, utilitarian mattress that offers little more than a suggestion of comfort. The texture of the cell was something James began to map with his fingertips, a way of grounding himself in a reality that felt increasingly distant. He sat on the edge of that bunk, feeling the coolness of the steel through his clothes, a sensation so consistent it eventually became a part of his own skin. In this place, the vibrant chaos of the outside world, the rustle of October leaves, the distant hum of traffic, was replaced by a rhythmic, mechanical soundtrack. Every few minutes, the steady, heavy tread of a guard's boots would echo down the tier. It was a sound that was both comforting and terrifying in its predictability. A cadence of authority that signaled the world was still turning, even if James was no longer a part of its motion. The footsteps would grow louder, a sharp clatter against the concrete, then fade away into a distant, rhythmic pulse, leaving behind a silence that was almost heavy enough to touch. Have you ever sat in a room so quiet you could hear your own heart? That was James's world now. In the profound stillness of the late hour, the thrumming of his own pulse became a deafening reminder of his own existence. Most men in his position might have shouted. They might have rattled the bars or protested their innocence to the empty air, trying to fill the void with the sound of their own defiance. But James offered only a deep, abiding silence. He sat with his hands folded, his gaze fixed on a point on the wall where the gray paint had begun to flake away, revealing the darker, older layers beneath. There was no anger in his posture, only a quiet, weary acceptance that the path he had walked had finally reached its terminus. According to the reports from that evening, the officers noted a lack of resistance that was almost unsettling. It was as if he'd been waiting for this containment, as if the walls were not a punishment, but a necessary boundary for a soul that had wandered too far into the dark. The walls did not just hold him in, they seemed to listen to his unspoken regrets. In the isolation of the cell, every memory he held became more vivid, more pointed. He could see the flickers of his past as if they were projected onto the concrete. Small moments of kindness he had neglected. The quiet face of the person he used to be before the weight of his choices became too much to carry. As the hours drifted toward the early morning, the light in the hallway remained a harsh, flickering fluorescent white, casting long, distorted shadows through the bars and across the floor. These shadows moved slowly, stretching and shrinking as the night progressed. A silent sundial marking the passage of time in a place where time usually stood still. James watched them with a detached curiosity, his mind unwinding from the frantic energy of the arrest and settling into a state of hollow reflection. He was a man who had sought an ending, and in the cold, unblinking eye of the holding cell, he found the first few chapters of a finality he had long craved. The concrete was heavy, the steel was cold, but for the first time in many years, the uncertainty of the run was over. He was held fast, and in that holding, there was a strange, tragic peace that allowed the first ripples of sleep to finally take hold of his tired mind. The transition from the cold, unyielding silence of a holding cell to the structured, rhythmic atmosphere of a courtroom is a journey of sensory shifts. We find that the air in the Hall of Justice is different from the stagnant breath of the jail. It carries the scent of floor wax, old mahogany, and the faint metallic tang of an overworked heating system. The oak benches, polished by decades of anxious waiting, offer a firm, grounding presence for those who sit upon them. In this space, the chaos of the crime is filtered through the steady, predictable mesh of legal protocol. The high ceilings catch the soft rustle of shuffling papers and the distant, rhythmic ticking of a wall clock, creating a sonic environment that feels both vast and strangely intimate. At the center of this choreographed stillness sat the judge, a man whose presence was defined by a low, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. His voice was not one of anger or haste, but of a deep, practiced resonance that commanded the room without ever needing to rise in volume. When he spoke, the words felt heavy and deliberate, like stones being placed one by one into a calm pool of water. This vocal gravity provided a sense of absolute authority, a reassurance that despite the darkness of the details being discussed, there was a steady hand on the scales of justice. The courtroom was a theater of order, and the judge's baritone was the steady pulse that kept the proceedings from drifting into the emotional turbulence that often follows such a tragedy. The defense team, however, found themselves caught in what we might call a procedural loop. In most cases of this magnitude, the struggle is to prove innocence or to find a justification, a flicker of a reason why a life was taken. They looked for the familiar markers of a motive, greed, passion, or perhaps a sudden, uncontrollable break from reality. Yet, as they sifted through the evidence and the interviews, they found only a hollow space where a motive should have been. Every line of inquiry led back to the same quiet, unsettling conclusion. The defendant offered no excuses and sought no mercy. He simply sat there, his hands resting calmly on the table, watching the lawyers work with the detached curiosity of a man observing a rainstorm from behind a thick pane of glass. This created a profound challenge for the legal system, which is built upon the foundational assumption of self-preservation. The law is designed for those who fight to live. It has no script for the man who asks to go. We see the gears of the machine begin to grind and hesitate when they encounter a soul that refuses to resist. Usually, the adversarial nature of a trial creates a balance, a tension between the push for punishment and the pull for leniency. But here, the tension was absent. The defendant was in total alignment with the harshest possible outcome. He didn't just accept the weight of the law, he leaned into it, inviting the heavy concrete of the system to finally settle over him and bring his story to a close. The prosecution presented the facts with a measured, clinical detachment, laying out the timeline of the events as if they were reading a ledger of historic dates. They spoke of the forensic findings and the witness statements, their voices blending into the general hum of the room's acoustics. There was no need for theatrics when the accused was the state's most cooperative witness. The contrarian angle began to emerge in the quiet whispers of the gallery and the furrowed brows of the legal experts. They questioned whether a system designed to protect rights could truly function when the individual in question was actively waiving every right in favor of his own end. It was a paradox of justice. A man using the very tools of his defense to ensure his own destruction. As the afternoon light faded, casting long amber shadows across the courtroom floor, the proceedings took on a quality of a lullaby. The repetition of legal jargon, the citations, the motions, the sustained and overruled objections, acted as a rhythmic drone that lowered the collective heart rate of the room. The initial sharp edges of the case were being smoothed over by the constant, grinding motion of the bureaucracy. It was a process of sanitization, where the raw, jagged reality of a human life lost was being converted into a series of numbered exhibits and leather-bound files. In this atmosphere of procedural calm, the horror of the past was being catalogued and filed away, making room for the finality that was soon to follow. The judge's gravelly baritone eventually called for a recess. The sound of his gavel hit in the wood with a dull, final thud that echoed softly in the rafters. The defendant was led away, moving with the same slow, deliberate grace he had shown since his arrest. He did not look back at the gallery, nor did he look at the lawyers who were desperately trying to find a way to save a man who did not want to be saved. He walked back toward the shadows of the holding area, seemingly satisfied with the day's progress. The court had begun its work, the machine was in motion, and the script, though written for a different kind of man, was being followed to its inevitable, quiet conclusion. Would you like me to continue the story into the next chapter, where we explore the contents of the letter he sent to the governor? The metal table in his cell felt like a block of ice under his forearms, a stark contrast to the humid, stagnant air that seemed to settle in the corners of the room. It was late, that particular hour of the night where the prison sounds change. The distant clanging of gates replaced by the low, rhythmic hum of the ventilation system, and the occasional, sharp cough of a restless man 3 doors down. James sat with a single sheet of yellow legal paper smoothed out before him. The paper was cheap, slightly translucent if held to the light, with fibers that felt rough and organic beneath his fingertips. He traced the blue horizontal lines with his thumb, centering himself before he began the task he'd been contemplating since the verdict was read. The pen was a simple plastic instrument, its ink reservoir nearly half empty. But as he pressed it to the page, the sound was disproportionately loud in the stillness. It was a rhythmic, scratching cadence, the sound of a man carving his intentions into the record of the living. He did not write with the frantic energy of the desperate, nor with the shaking hand of the fearful. Instead, his movements were deliberate and slow. He watched as the ink bled slightly into the porous yellow grain of the paper, creating small, dark halos around each letter. The flickering overhead light, a fluorescent tube that had been buzzing with a low-frequency irritation for days, cast a staccato rhythm of shadows across his work. In those moments of shadow, the paper looked gray. In the bursts of light, it returned to its sickly, jaundice yellow. In his letter to the governor, James bypassed the usual legal jargon that his attorneys had spent months refining. He did not ask for a stay of execution, nor did he point to the procedural errors that cluttered his case files. Instead, he spoke of a different kind of justice, one that was internal and quiet. He wrote that while the world viewed his sentence as a punishment to be avoided, he viewed the passage of time as the true weight he could no longer carry. He explained to the officials sitting in a far-off, mahogany-paneled office that mercy is not always found in the extension of a life, but is often found in the end of the wait. To James, the cell was not just a room of stone and steel. It was a suspended state of being, a hallway between what he had done and what he was meant to become. He described the texture of the silence that surrounded him, a silence so thick it felt like a physical shroud. The words on the page began to form a narrative of exhaustion, not the kind of tiredness that sleep can cure, but a profound soul weariness that comes from standing at a closed door for too long. He wrote about the flicker of the lights, noting how they seemed to pulse in time with his own heartbeat, a reminder that he was still tethered to a world he was ready to leave. His words weren't a challenge to the state, but a humble request for the curtain to fall. He was asking for the finality that the law had promised, but the bureaucracy was delaying. As the letter neared its end, the ink on the yellow paper seemed to glisten under the dying fluorescent bulb. He looked at the grain of the paper one last time, feeling the slight indentation the pen had left on the surface, a tactile map of his resolve. He had said what needed to be said. He had stripped away the layers of defense and reached the core of his own reality. The letter was a bridge. A quiet hand extended through the bars, asking for the one thing no one else in that building wanted: an end to the story. Would you like me to continue into the next chapter, where we follow James on the long walk toward the chamber where his request would finally be honored? The silence that follows a decision of such magnitude is rarely empty. Instead, it fills with the small, persistent sounds of a life reduced to its barest essentials. For James, the transition from a man fighting his destiny to a man welcoming it changed the very texture of his surroundings. The heavy iron doors no longer sounded like a rhythmic slamming of hope, but rather like the steady ticking of a clock he had finally learned to read. On the row, the day does not begin with the sun, which is a distant and secondary thought. It begins at 5 o'clock in the morning with the sharp, metallic rattle of a food slot and the inescapable, heavy scent of burnt coffee drifting through the tiers. It is a smell that defines the architecture of the morning, bitter and scorched, ground into the concrete walls by decades of repetition. We find that in this environment, James developed a peculiar relationship with the concept of duration. Time on the row doesn't march. It drifts like smoke in a windless room. It pools in the corners of the cell, thick and hazy, until one day bleeds into the next, without the sharp edges of a calendar. He watched the seasons change, not by the turning of leaves or the falling of snow, but by the way the light hit a 4-inch wide sliver of glass high on the outer wall. In the winter, the light was a pale, weak gray that vanished before the afternoon meal. In the summer, it was a searing, golden needle that tracked a slow, agonizing path across the floor of his cell, marking the hours with more precision than any watch could provide. He became an expert in the geometry of shadows, knowing exactly what time it was by how far the darkness had climbed up the leg of his small cot. There was an unexpected intimacy that grew in the quiet spaces between the bars. The guards, men who had spent as much time in the prison as the inmates they watched, began to see a different side of the man who had stopped fighting. One afternoon, a young officer brought a small, broken mechanical toy to James's cell. It was a tin bird that was supposed to flap its wings, a gift for the guard's young daughter that had fallen silent. James took the object with a gentleness that seemed out of place in a room built for punishment. His fingers, once used for violence, now moved with the grace of the clockmaker he had once dreamed of becoming. He used a sharpened plastic spoon and a bit of wire to realign the tiny gears, his breath steady and slow as he worked. When the bird finally hummed to life, the clicking of its internal springs echoed through the cell block, a thematic callback to the intricate machinery of the timepieces he had loved as a boy. In that moment, the predator was gone, replaced by a craftsman who found peace in the simple act of making something right. The passage of years brought a stillness to his spirit that few could comprehend. He spent hours watching the dust motes dance in the narrow shafts of light, seeing in their chaotic movement a kind of universal order. He noticed the way the moss grew in the damp crevices of the exercise yard, a vibrant, stubborn green that defied the gray monotony of the stone. These small, mundane anchors kept him grounded as the legal machinery hummed in the background, eventually aligning with his own internal clock. He was no longer a man waiting for a tragedy. He was a man waiting for a conclusion that he had authored himself. The long walk was not a journey toward an end, but a transition into the final gear of a mechanism he had spent a lifetime trying to understand. Through that 4-inch window, the world outside continued its frantic pace. But inside the row, James had finally found the rhythm of a heartbeat that was no longer hurried by fear. He had learned that even in a room where time seemed to stand still, every second was a gift of clarity, a slow unwinding of the mainspring until the tension was finally gone. Would you like me to move into the next chapter, where we witness the quiet solemnity of the final meal and the closing of the circle James so carefully drew? The heavy iron door of the cell transitioned from a barrier into a gateway. As the midday sun reached its zenith, casting a narrow golden bar of light across the concrete floor. In the specialized unit where James spent these final hours, the air always carried a particular scent, a mixture of floor wax, industrial detergent, and the faint metallic tang of aged plumbing. But today, the atmosphere was different. There was a shift in the olfactory landscape, a breakdown of the prison's sterile monotony as the scent of seasoned flour and hot oil began to drift through the ventilation shafts. It was a sensory bridge to a world James had left behind years ago, a reminder of Sunday afternoons and wooden kitchen tables. The arrival of the final meal is often portrayed in fiction as a moment of macabre tension. Yet for James, it was the ultimate mundane anchor. It was the point where the abstract nature of his legal battles and the philosophical weight of his choices finally tethered themselves to something tangible, something earthly. When the tray was eventually passed through the slot, it didn't feel like a precursor to an end, but rather a final quiet celebration of the senses. He looked down at the arrangement before him. There was the fried chicken, its skin a rugged golden landscape of salt and pepper, still radiating a gentle heat that he could feel against his palms as he lifted the tray. Beside it sat a mound of mashed potatoes, a small pool of gravy slowly cratering in the center, and a tall plastic cup of sweet tea, the condensation on the outside forming tiny, clear beads that mirrored the stillness of the room. There is a strange, quiet dignity in a final meal, a small island of normalcy in a sea of the inevitable. James picked up the plastic fork, noting its surprising weightlessness. In a world defined by heavy steel and reinforced concrete, this small, flimsy utensil was a reminder of the fragility of the moment. He began to eat slowly, the pace of his movements deliberate and unhurried. The crunch of the breading was a sharp, grounding sound in the silence of the cell. He tasted the rosemary and the garlic, the familiar comfort of the bird and the deep, syrupy hit of the tea that coated his throat with a soothing coolness. Each bite was a deliberate act of presence. He was not a man rushing toward a finish line. He was a man savoring the texture of the present. The temperature of the plate was a comfort, a warmth that seeped into his fingers, grounding him in the physical reality of his body. According to the guards who observed him through the small glass portal, there was no trembling in his hands, no frantic desperation in his appetite. He ate with the focused calm of someone who had already said his goodbyes and was simply waiting for the carriage to arrive. James was at peace with this moment, a soft spoiler to the tragedy that had defined his life. The man who had begged for this conclusion was finally receiving the only mercy he believed he deserved. The meal was not a bribe for his soul or a final taunt from the state. It was a period at the end of a long, exhausting sentence. As he finished the last of the tea, the ice cubes rattled softly against the bottom of the cup, a rhythmic, musical sound that seemed to echo the ticking of a clock that no longer caused him anxiety. He set the plastic fork down neatly across the empty plate. The weight of the meal sat comfortably in his stomach, a physical sensation of fullness that contrasted with the emotional emptiness he had carried for so long. He leaned back against the cool wall, watching the shadows of the bars lengthen as the afternoon began its slow drift into evening. The circle he had drawn so carefully around his life was almost closed, and the silence that followed the meal was not heavy, but light, like the fading light on the horizon. Would you like me to proceed to the next chapter, where we enter the chamber of silence and witness the final, hushed steps of James's journey into the stillness? The transition from the world of the living to the world of the machine was marked not by a sudden rupture, but by a slow, measured cadence. As the clock moved toward the designated hour, the air in the corridor seemed to thicken with the scent of floor wax and old stone, a sensory anchor to a reality that James was now leaving behind. The walk to the chamber was a procession of shadows, a silent movement of figures through the dim light of the facility's inner sanctum. There was no rattling of chains or raised voices, only the rhythmic sound of soft-soled shoes against the linoleum. The guards moved with a practiced, professional distance, their presence forming a barrier between the man who had asked for this end and the world that was finally granting it. Each step took them further away from the cells, away from the echoes of other lives, and deeper into the quiet heart of the institution, where the technical finality of the law awaited. Inside the chamber, the light was steady and pale, casting long reflections across the polished surfaces. In the center of the room sat the chair, a heavy construction of dark wood and historical weight. To look at it was to see a relic of a different era, a piece of 1980s engineering that felt both archaic and terrifyingly precise. The leather straps were thick and worn to a soft, dark patina from decades of maintenance, their brass buckles gleaming under the overhead lights. Every fitting was meticulously cared for, the metal cool to the touch and the leather smelling faintly of oil and age. This was the machinery of justice, a physical manifestation of a society's ultimate resolve, stripped of all emotion and reduced to its mechanical components. There was a strange, muted beauty in the brass and the wood, a craftsmanship dedicated to a singular, irreversible purpose. James approached the chair with a steady gait, his eyes tracing the grain of the wood as if finding one last, mundane detail to hold on to. As the officers began the process of securing the straps, the room fell into a profound stillness. We see the careful movements of hands tightening the leather over his wrists and ankles, the click of the brass buckles sounding like small, sharp punctuations in the silence, the texture of the grain, the coldness of the metal, and the weight of the air all merged into a single sensory experience of transition. There was no struggle, no hesitation. The atmosphere was one of deep, heavy resolution, a feeling that a long-running clock was finally reaching its final second. When the technicians had finished their work and the last adjustment had been made, the warden leaned in, his voice a low murmur in the quiet room. He asked if there were any final words, a standard formality that felt, in this moment, like a bridge between the past and the inevitable future. James looked toward the observation glass, though his gaze seemed to fix on something far beyond the walls of the room. His voice was calm, devoid of the tremors of fear or the weight of regret. It was the voice of a man who had finally reached the destination he had spent years seeking. He spoke only 3 words. "I am ready." The silence that followed was absolute, a void in which the only sound was the low, electric hum of the system being primed. It was a sound that had been heard in this room many times before, yet it felt unique to this specific request. The machinery of justice hummed one last time, answering a request that had been years in the making. In that hum, the complexities of the legal battles, the weight of the crimes, and the long years of waiting seemed to dissolve into a single, technical frequency. The light in the room remained steady. The shadows of the brass fittings stayed long and still, and the world outside continued its slow rotation, unaware that a long journey had finally come to its quiet, promised end. As the hum eventually faded back into the natural silence of the night, a sense of stillness settled over the chamber. The task was complete, and the energy of the room shifted from anticipation to a solemn, retrospective peace. The danger, the questions, and the long pursuit of an end were now part of the archives of the past. You are safe now, resting in the quiet of the present, while the history of James remains behind those heavy doors, resolved and still. The night is long, and the world is quiet, leaving you in the comfort of your own peaceful, undisturbed rest. Would you like me to proceed to the next chapter, where we explore the aftermath in the trees and how the world began to heal once the silence had taken hold? The transition from a night of heavy consequence to the first light of a new day is often a subtle, almost invisible shift. In the small, wooded corners of West Columbia, the sun began its ascent over the tree line just as it had for generations, casting long, amber shadows across the gravel driveways and the quiet porches of the neighborhood. There was no thunderous proclamation that the tension of the previous years had finally dissipated. Instead, there was only the sound of the morning breeze moving through the pine needles and the distant, rhythmic chirping of birds returning to their daily routines. The world continued its steady rotation, seemingly indifferent to the fact that a long and harrowing chapter of local history had reached its absolute conclusion. For the families who had lived in the shadow of this tragedy, the morning brought a sensation that was difficult to name. It wasn't the exuberant relief one might expect after a long-awaited resolution, but rather a quiet, hollow peace. It was the feeling of a weight being removed after so many years that the body had forgotten how to stand without it. We can imagine the victims' loved ones sitting in their kitchens, watching the steam rise from their coffee mugs, realizing that for the first time in a decade, there was no pending court date, no looming appeal, and no unanswered questions regarding the fate of the man who had caused them so much grief. The silence in their homes was no longer a silence of waiting. It was a silence of finality. The streets of the town felt different, too. Neighbors who had whispered about the case over backyard fences for years now found themselves speaking of other things. The weather, the upcoming harvest, the simple mechanics of a life no longer tethered to a courtroom drama. The heavy atmosphere that had once clung to the wooded areas near the crime scenes seemed to lift, replaced by the mundane reality of nature reclaiming its space. Moss grew over the stones, and the undergrowth thickened, burying the past under layers of green and brown. In the administrative offices of the county, the process of judicial closure was unfolding with a cold, mechanical precision. We see the finality in the movement of a clerk's hand as the thick manila folder, bulging with years of testimony, forensic reports, and legal motions, was pulled from the active stack. There is a specific sound to a case being closed. The heavy, rhythmic thud of a rubber stamp hitting a page, leaving behind a permanent ink mark that signifies the end of the state's involvement. The file was moved from the desk to a metal cabinet, and finally to the archives, where it would sit in the stillness of the basement, a collection of papers that no longer had the power to disrupt the lives of the living. The legal system had done its work. The clock had run its course, and the man who had begged for this end had finally received it. Yet, as the families looked out at the sunlight filtering through the trees, they understood a truth that the law rarely acknowledges. Justice doesn't always feel like a victory. Sometimes it just feels like the end of a long, tired song. It is the final note that lingers in the air before fading into the background of a much larger, much older silence. As the day progressed, the town moved forward, not by forgetting, but by finally being allowed to look away from the darkness and toward the horizon. You are here in the safety of that stillness now, far removed from the echoes of the past, resting in a world that has already found its way back to the light. The gavel's final strike is not a loud sound, but a heavy one, a dull thud that ripples through the wood of the bench and into the very floorboards of the room. It is a sound that signifies the end of a long, arduous journey through the labyrinth of human choice and consequence. In the quiet that follows, there is a profound sense of weight being shifted, as if the air itself has become denser with the gravity of what has transpired. We often think of justice as a sharp, dividing line, but in the stillness of a late hour, it feels more like a slow settling of dust. The legal proceedings have concluded. The documents have been filed away in acid-free folders, and the courtroom lights have been dimmed, leaving only the memory of words spoken in the pursuit of an impossible peace. We carry our choices like stones until we find the place where we can finally lay them down. For some, that place is a cell. For others, it is a confession whispered into the cold air of a winter morning. Guilt is not a sudden storm that passes with the morning sun, but a constant, low-frequency hum that vibrates in the marrow of the bone. It is the shadow that stretches long across the grass, even when the sun is at its highest point. To look back at a life defined by a single, catastrophic moment is to realize that memory is a burden we are never truly coached on how to carry. It sits in the corner of the mind like an old piece of furniture, familiar and immovable, catching the light in ways that remind us of what was lost. The architecture of a conscience is a delicate thing, built over a lifetime of small decisions that eventually form the foundation of our character. When that foundation is cracked by a deed that cannot be undone, the entire structure begins to lean. We see this in the way the spirit slows down, the way the eyes begin to search the horizon for a forgiveness that may never arrive. The pursuit of execution, the literal begging for an end, is perhaps the ultimate expression of a soul that has grown too tired to support its own weight. It is an admission that the silence of the grave is preferable to the clamor of a mind that will not stop replaying the past. As the tempo of the world slows to a rhythmic, steady pulse, we find ourselves reflecting on the nature of these heavy burdens. The clock on the wall ticks with a soft, mechanical certainty, marking the passage of time that heals some wounds while merely numbing others. In the quiet of your room, the shadows are soft and protective, a gentle contrast to the harsh glare of a witness stand. Here, there is no judgment, only the drifting observation of a story that has reached its natural conclusion. The stories of the past are like old maps. The paths are already drawn, the destinations already reached. We are simply tracing the lines with our fingers, safe in the knowledge that the journey is over and the road is still. There is a strange, quiet comfort in the finality of a settled life. The tension that once held the breath in the chest has dissipated, replaced by a slow, even rise and fall. The heavy stones of choice are resting now, settled deep into the earth where the grass grows thick and green. Memory remains, but it has lost its edge, becoming a soft blur like the edges of a dream. You are drifting now, moving further away from the sharp details of the day and into the vast, calm motion of the night. The gavel has echoed, the echo has faded, and all that remains is the profound and lasting peace of a world that has finally been allowed to go to sleep. Would you like me to continue the narrative into the final drift-off phase? The heavy iron door of the cell stands open now, a silent invitation to a room that no longer holds a tenant. Inside, the air is cooling, the lingering warmth of a human presence slowly dissipating into the stone walls. A janitor moves with practiced rhythmic motions, his mop bucket trailing a faint scent of lemon and industrial soap. The water sloshes softly, a liquid cadence that marks the transition from a place of confinement to a place of memory. Each stroke of the mop across the linoleum floor erases a footprint, a scuff mark, a shadow of the man who spent its final days begging for this very stillness. The small desk is bare. The cot is stripped of its thin, gray blankets. There is a profound, almost reverent quiet that settles over the space, the kind of quiet that only exists once a long and turbulent storm has finally passed. James often thought of his own mind as a piece of machinery that had been wound too tight. In the quiet hours before the end, He had described an 18th century carriage clock he had once encountered in a dusty antique shop, a marvel of horological engineering. To understand his desire for the end, one must understand the intricate brass gears of that clock. Imagine a world of polished metal and delicate tension. The mainspring, a coiled ribbon of tempered steel, held within it a lifetime of potential energy, pushing against the resistance of time itself. The gears were small, some no larger than a grain of sand, with teeth so fine they looked like the frayed edges of a golden leaf. Each wheel served a specific, unyielding purpose. The center wheel, the third wheel, the fourth wheel, all turning in a synchronized dance, governed by the rhythmic ticking of the escapement. The brass plates that held these gears were etched with fine floral patterns, hidden away where no one would ever see them. A secret beauty known only to the maker and the one who eventually took the machine apart. James felt that his life was like the balance wheel of that clock, oscillating back and forth, caught in a perpetual state of motion that offered no respite. The hairspring, that tiny, spiraling wire that regulates the beat, was, in his mind, stretched to the point of snapping. He spoke of the pivot points, where the steel axles met the synthetic rubies used for bearings. Even with the finest oil, time eventually creates friction. The oil dries, the dust of the decades settles into the teeth, and the smooth rotation becomes a jagged, grinding struggle. He didn't want to be repaired. He didn't want to be rewound. He looked at the complexity of his own existence, the gears of guilt, the wheels of memory, the heavy weights of his actions, and he simply wanted the pendulum to find its center and stay there. He craved the moment when the ticking would stop, not out of malice, but out of a desperate need for the mechanical peace of a stopped clock. A clock that is finished with the burden of telling time. Outside the prison walls, the sky has opened up, releasing a deluge that feels as though it might wash away the very foundations of the earth. The rain does not merely fall. It performs a symphony upon the landscape of the penitentiary. On the wide, flat expanse of the gravel yard, the droplets strike with a sharp, percussive thwack, displacing tiny pebbles and creating a million miniature craters. It is a coarse, earthy sound, a low-frequency rumble that vibrates through the soles of one's feet. But when the wind shifts and the rain lashes against the high metal fences, the sound transforms. It becomes a metallic hiss, a high-pitched shh that rings out like 1,000 tiny needles hitting a silver plate. The chain link vibrates, humming with the energy of the storm, a cold and industrial vibration that echoes the loneliness of the perimeter. Then, there are the concrete walls themselves, immense, gray, and unyielding. When the rain hits these vertical surfaces, it makes a dull, heavy thud, a sound of absorption. The water clings to the porous stone, darkening it from a pale ash to a deep charcoal, before gathering into rivulets that weep down the face of the building. You can hear the rhythmic glug of the heavy iron gutters as they struggle to channel the overflow. A deep, hollow resonance that sounds like the building itself is exhaling. On the corrugated tin roof of the guard shack, the rain is a frantic, chaotic drum roll, a white noise so thick it drowns out the possibility of speech. It is a textured world of sound, the splash of puddles forming in the depressions of the asphalt, the soft patter against the glass of the high, narrow windows, and the constant underlying roar of the atmosphere. It is a cleansing sound, an auditory blanket that wraps around a prison, isolating it from the rest of the world and signaling that the day's work is done. In the courtroom where the final plea was heard, the judge's bench stands as a silent witness, its dark oak grain glowing softly under the dim security lights. This wood has a history that predates the very concept of the law in this land. In the early 1800s, this oak was a sapling in a dense, ancient forest, reaching for the sun amidst a sea of green. It survived harsh winters and blistering summers, growing rings of density that recorded every drought and every windfall. When it was finally felled, the wood was seasoned for years, losing its moisture but gaining an iron-like strength. The craftsmen who shaped it into this bench used hand planes and chisels, following the natural curves of the grain, polishing it with oils until it took on the deep, amber hue of a sunset. For over a century, this wood has absorbed the tension of the room. It has felt the weight of trembling hands, the pounding of the gavel, and the heavy silence of life-altering decisions. It has been a silent observer to the full spectrum of human frailty. When James stood before it, begging for his own execution, the oak did not flinch. It held the weight of the judge, the weight of the law, and the weight of the tragedy. The wood is cool to the touch now, smooth and indifferent, a physical manifestation of time's long reach. It saw the beginning of the story in the forest, and it saw the conclusion of the story in the hushed courtroom. It remains solid and enduring, while the lives that pass before it are as fleeting as the shadows cast by the afternoon sun. We move now, away from the cold stone and the historic oak, traveling back through the rainy night toward the comfort of your own space. The distance between the prison and your room is not measured in miles, but in the softening of the air and the receding of the narrative. The story of James, the man who sought the silence, has reached its natural end. The gears have stopped. The rain has washed the gravel clean. The law has found its conclusion, not in anger, but in the somber fulfillment of a final request. The macro loop of his life, which began in turmoil and traveled through the darkest corridors of the human experience, has finally closed. The circle is complete. In your room, the only light comes from a single candle flame, flickering gently on the bedside table. It is a small, warm point of focus in a world of shadows. As you watch it, the flame begins to shrink, the wick having given all it has to give. It dances one last time, a tiny golden spark, and then, with a soft, silent breath of air, it is extinguished. A faint, thin trail of white smoke curls upward, twisting into the dark before vanishing entirely. The room is now bathed in a total, velvet blackness, a darkness that is not empty, but full of the peace you have earned. The sound of the rain outside your window is louder now, a steady, rhythmic pulse that lulls the senses. It is the sound of the world being cared for, of the dust being settled, and the heat being cooled. You are tucked safely away from the elements, protected by the walls of your home and the heavy blankets that press down on you with a comforting weight. There are no more questions to answer. There are no more gears to turn. The intricate clockwork of the day has been stilled, and the silence that follows is a gift. The story of the man who begged for his own execution is no longer a source of tension. It is a closed book on a high shelf. It is a part of the past, a history that had been resolved and tucked away. You can feel your breathing slowing, matching the cadence of the rain. Each inhale brings a sense of stillness. Each exhale releases the last lingering thoughts of the waking world. The darkness is a soft cushion, inviting you to let go, to sink deeper into the mattress, to allow the boundaries of your mind to soften and dissolve. The rain continues to fall, a constant, gentle reminder that the world is being washed clean. Every street, every leaf, every stone is receiving this cool, liquid benediction. The peace that James sought has been found, and the peace you seek is here, in the quiet of this room, in the rhythm of the storm, and in the safety of the night. You are far away from the gavel, far away from the courtroom, and far away from the struggle. There is only the rain, the dark, and the deep, restorative sleep that awaits you.